The Six Sigma project that I chose for this class was to look at the effective professional development on learner-centered pedagogy or best practices in active learning spaces at the secondary level in public high schools. The 5 stages or parts of the Six Sigma process that I'll be speaking about today are the define, measure, analyze, implement, and control. So let's start right away with defining the problem and why this research project has the impact that it does within our school system as well as other schools. First of all, let's take a deep look at engagement of students as they progress from the elementary schools into the middle and the high school. And so the Gallup poll took a look at students in grades 5 through 12 in 2018 and reported that as students are in 5th grade, almost 3/4 of them feel like they're highly engaged or there's high levels of engagement within their learning. However, as they progress into the middle school, that drops to about half of those students. And as they get into the high school level, it almost drops to under 1/3 of those students. Even more alarming is when we take a closer look at students identifying whether they're engaged, not engaged, or actively disengaged. We find that only half of the students in grades 5 through 12 indicated they were engaged. Not engaged, about 1/3 of the students, but most alarming are the students that are actually indicating that they're actively disengaged, which is about 1/4 of the students who participated in the Gallup poll. So when we look at student engagement, we can really look at the impact of when students are engaged versus when they're not engaged. We know that when students are engaged, there's just going to be overall better mental health as well as physical health. We also know that we have improved grades and achievement scores through other quantitative studies that have been done. We also know that there's an impact on the 4 C's that are critical to our students and their employability skills as they move out to be career, community, and college ready. We also know that when they're not engaged, we're going to see higher rates of dropouts. There's going to be problem behaviors and health conditions because of students being sedentary or, again, mental health being a part of that as well. We also know that we have an employment epidemic, and this was happening even before the COVID pandemic, in that our students aren't necessarily prepared to succeed in the workforce. And so when we take a closer look at the FESUP model that was presented in class through our professor, we know that there's also, besides a financial impact, an environmental and a social, which within a school system and with people can be even more important than just the financial impact. But when we look at the financial impact, if people aren't prepared for the workforce, that has problems in terms of our employability rates. We also know if we have to pay more for mental health and physical health, that can be a strain on the economy as well. And we also know that if students are dropping out of school, generally that's a pipeline into the prison system as well. When we take a look at the environmental and social impacts, we know that if students are engaged and they're collaborating, it's definitely going to improve their environment. We know that if we can improve the professional development that's focused on these best practices, it's going to create a much better learning environment for our students. And with that, we know that we can improve the behaviors as well. The social impact is through, again, student engagement and joy of learning, students wanting to be there and wanting to learn. We also know that if they are engaged, there's usually a positive social and emotional learning that's going to happen for our students and the relationships that they develop with other students as well as in the community and with their educators as well. And no doubt when people are healthier in terms of mental health, there's going to also be that improved attendance and again, students wanting to be there. So the 2 goals of my Six Sigma project really came down to this. I wanted to really take a closer look from a quantitative approach rather than a qualitative, which I did in my dissertation, and examine educators' classroom practices that had a pedagogical approach which would allow students to be engaged and for collaboration in active learning spaces. Specifically, I wanted to look at the PD, the professional development that these educators were being provided on the learner-centered pedagogy and how it was working in these flexible or active learning spaces to really impact student learning through engagement and collaboration. So let's dig more into the measurement. So in order to do the measurement, my methodology was to focus really on secondary level classrooms in our district, and we had 5 or 6 of those that actually volunteered and wanted to be a part of and were in the active learning classroom pilot that we had started about 2 years ago. And so through this process, I conducted pre-PD observations in classrooms in the winter of 2021. After there had been a few training sessions with the staff members, and they were into those active learning spaces, in the spring of 2022, I did a mid-year observation, and then I followed it up this fall, in fall of 2022, post-PD. So after about 4 or 5 sessions that teachers were able to participate in, half-day, full-day sessions. And within that, I looked for 10 best practices that we truly believed in our district would have that impact and improve our defined problem of the student engagement and the joy of learning. And those really focused on learner-centered pedagogy. Here you can see those 10 approaches that we really felt had the most impact. You can also see the data that compares the winter to the spring and the fall. You can see that, when we first started out with these observations, some of these, were under that 40% range of being evident within the classrooms. You can see mid-year, though, we had some great strides in some of these areas as well. And then you can also see that in some cases, we truly then did experience 100% in other areas after post-PD. However, there still was one area, even after all 3 observations and the professional development, was the student work, process over product being displayed on classroom walls. But overall, definitely some great impact occurring because of that professional development. I also did a Likert scale where in that post-professional development asked the educators on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being fair, 1 being poor, 2 fair, 3 good, and 4 excellent, to rank the quality of the professional development that they were involved in. And you can see here where those realms fell within that area of the teachers indicating it being beneficial in terms of the professional development. What this really allowed us then to do is to take a look as we continue with other pilot teachers that are coming on board, where we really needed to beef up and do maybe a little bit more in professional development to support those educators, as well as other areas that were scoring in the 4s or the upper 3s of ones that we would replicate in our future professional development. In the descriptive statistics, which falls within the measure section, I compared the winter of 2022, so the pre-PD, with the fall after PD, so what had happened this past October. And you can see that mean score went from 28 up to 82. Now, I didn't include the spring PD, which happened in 2022, but that I believe was at 72 when I ran that for the paper section. Other things within here that you can identify are those medians and those modes, as well as I'm looking at the variances, which we'll hit on a little bit more when we get into the analyze section. You can see the range section, the minimums and the maximums, and kind of that confidence level, which again, I'll talk a little bit more as we proceed in. So let's jump into the analyze section. Within the analyze section, wanted to identify if a service, and in this case it was professional development in education, whether that service or that professional development produced a desired effect in those best practices of that learner-centered pedagogy then happening within those active learning spaces for those students. Really, when we talk about the analyze phase, it's really bridging that measurement phase with that improvement when we look at the DMAIC. And one thing that was evident within our textbook as we dug into the FESUP model and even took a deeper look into Appendix A, which was a review of statistics, was in this case, we weren't necessarily looking for a significant relationship, but we wanted to know if there was a significant difference between our pre-PD and our post-PD. And so with that, conducted a paired t-test sample of those pre-PD observations with those post-PD observations. And here you find the table of that t-test for those paired samples between the winter 2021 and the fall 2022. So the pre-PD and the post-PD. I do want to jump into the next slide to break down my analysis of that data, which went a little bit more detailed within the paper. But when we look at that, the before PD again was a mean of 28 and the post PD was 82. So some great results moving through those three observations. And again, indicating that there was a 72 in that spring one. When we're looking at the confidence interval, it did between the before PD and the post PD go from a 10 to a 22.82. As the researcher in this project and digging deeper into the analysis, there was a significant increase that the researcher identified from the before professional development to the post-professional development of those learner-centered pedagogies. And when breaking it down into what that t-test meant, overall, willing to take that risk in order to make this professional development happen. As well, I would say that there was a significant difference between the means, indicating that this professional development of those best practices did have an impact on the educators, which then ultimately would have an impact on that student engagement, that joy of learning, and collaboration. When we look at the critical value, it was a 1.833 as we ran that test, and so that was important. And also indicating that there were two things that just weren't of importance within the Six Sigma project, and then there was the variance and the Pearson correlation. So let's move into the implement and the improve. I love this quote. I went back into our organizational management class that we had with Dr. Houtini, and love this quote because I think when we're talking about change in an organization, with these types of projects like Six Sigma or lean projects, which we want to make some improvement on a quantitative approach, there's really this freezing and this unfreezing of a system. And what it really does is creates that sense of urgency, shakes up the system a little bit, and thaws us from being able to do business in a more compelling way. And in this case, a more compelling way of how we're teaching in a classroom that engages students and makes them want to learn, as well as the financial, social, and environmental impacts that we talked about previously. When looking at the implementation and the improvement part of it, although I didn't do the NAT project and tool, I really came up with my own type of project management tool in which identified what the task or the action plan and even the resources needed that might be needed, a timeline in making that happen, who would be responsible for doing that, and then how would we know that we're being successful, what evidence or artifacts would come about with that. And so as we look at this, I would say that we would continue this quarterly professional development and networking for our teachers. And who would be responsible is a lot of these that you will see, so I won't indicate these each time, but really our Director of Instructional Technology along with myself as the Executive Director of Teaching and Learning. And you can see kind of then those tools, as well as working with a consultant from Steelcase, doing another visit to Grand Rapids to their design center and their innovation center and so forth. I think exit slips are really important as well in getting that feedback from the educators on those professional development tools. And so that's really, again, digging at those stakeholders which I identified early on in the process in the define stage. And then observations kind of fit into that as well. We've been implementing in all of our grade 3 through 12th grade classrooms multiple monitors and flat panels and taking out our interactive whiteboards. that we've been using. And so you can kind of see where that falls within that. There's no doubt in order to do this, we have to have a budget and we have to add more active learning spaces beyond what we currently have and try some areas to see really where they work, like art and music, some of our science with lab areas, and then even moving down into grades 1 and 2 to see the benefit of that as well. Continuing on with this project-based part, really looking at classroom visits and shadowing experiences for our educators. There was no doubt from my qualitative research that it was very important for educators to be able to do this. And you can again see kind of where that falls, knowing that we are doing that through the evidence and so forth. Continuing to do research, again, through customer feedback, and this now does include students as well, and getting their feedback on what is valuable to them as well. We did just pass a referendum, and it is to do 2 of our elementary buildings that are drastically growing and increasing, as well as our tech ed area at the high school level. And with that will also come some intentional designing of those classroom spaces and remodeling and renovations. And so we're pretty excited to work with the architects with that and making that happen. There's also just further qualitative data collection based on student achievement as well as quantitative. So really, I think that's a typo there. In this case, it was supposed to say quantitative because I want to take a closer look at our accountability assessment system that we're required to do by the state, and then how that relates, and can we zero in on the impact of the ACT and some of those other data sources on student achievement. And then just to continue to reevaluate our PD experiences and so forth. So again, just a quick overview of that. Feedback, surveys, and observations would be used to redesign that professional development. We want to continue to not only have active learning spaces, but within that to integrate technology, kind of the icing on the cake, and making sure that those best practices in learner-centered pedagogy are implemented. We have to continue that professional development. It's a must. And then there has to be an investment on the support for educators, which is the PD on the best practice. And that's going to help us on our return on investment with student engagement and collaboration. And a little bit later, I'll show you a model that I believe speaks to this as well. Actually, I'm going to show it to you right now. So when we were at Steelcase, doing a visit with about 8 or 10 of us in Grand Rapids, Michigan, we learned that in order to have an integrated active learning environment, and we love this approach because so many times people think it's you put the technology in the classroom or you provide them the fancy furniture and that's adjustable and movable. But it really, what people have overlooked over time is the pedagogy. And so this really brought all 3 of those pieces together. However, through my research, I came up with an integrated active learning system which has a pyramid in the center of it. And it really focuses on the learner-centered pedagogy being the base and the most important part of this. And then you have the learning space. And on top of it, the icing on the cake is the technology integration. And so you really come up with what's being taught and how is it being taught and how can you implement and supplement technology within the learning. Not that you go and you find the technology tool and then you implement it in the classroom and you hope that it works. I think on each side of this, I want to emphasize the support and investment as well as the return on investment. So we have to build teacher capacity and we have to build their teacher collective efficacy so that when they're working together as teams, they know that they have the impact, the true impact on student learning. We have to improve professional development that is focused on these learner-centered best practices and actions. And on the other side, if we're able to do that, our return on the investment is that focus on student learning and results and that achievement data that I talked about. We know that we can get at behavioral, cognitive, and emotional student engagement, and we know that we're going to have an increase in student engagement. And within this model, we have inputs and outputs, but it doesn't mean that it flows from one end to the other end and it goes through that circle. That's why I have the arrows around the outside saying that it loops around. It's a continuous improvement process as well, like the Six Sigma. I love this quote from Doug Reeves. I had an opportunity to see him speak, and he had talked about practice preceding behavior. And in this case, the practice precedes the behavior. Once the behavior is in place, then the educator's beliefs and their attitudes will be there as well. And so when we're able to do that, most people then must engage in a practice and behavior before they accept that it's really beneficial. Then they see the results, and then they believe that it's the right thing to do. So in this case, in this specific part of the Six Sigma process, implementation precedes the buy-in. It doesn't follow it. Let's move into the final stage, the control and the sustain stage. There is a lot of research out there, and I only put 2 of those specific points, but if teachers aren't provided with adequate training and support, they will revert to their old pedagogies and teaching methods rather than exploring innovative approaches. And this quote came to mind after listening to the video in the control section from Dr. Jacobson, where he talked about people revert back to their old ways. And this is a case of that as well, that we have to keep sustaining and having that professional development for our educators. Another quote, educators provided with PD and ongoing support around these flexible learning spaces is going to lead to substantial change, an increase in effect, and sustainability, which is so important for the long-term effect on student learning. One thing that I also wanted to emphasize in this whole control and sustain process is that it doesn't come at the end of the process, the quality, the design quality of it. It's throughout the entire process, and that is something that I heard loud and clear within the control section as well. So in order to do that and ensuring that this happens throughout the whole process, we have to keep those direct observations in active learning spaces happening. There has to be those exit slips, feedbacks, and surveys of our customers and stakeholders, which are our educators and students. There has to be increased qualitative measures as well as quantitative measures. There's needs to be a sustained quality of professional development. It has to keep happening, and it can happen through a variety of ways. Not only trainings, but you also have those peer observations and classroom visits, the opportunity to network with colleagues, going to conferences where there's best practices being taught. There's online learning, book studies, and feedback loops. Also, the ability throughout this, and we are in our district are a professional learning community, which is based on Lincolnshire, our Adelaide Stevenson in Lincolnshire, Illinois, and so it's really looking at building teacher collective efficacy, which has a 1.57 effect size according to John Hattie and all of his meta-analysis that he has done. And so I love this quote because I think it brings back that whole feedback opportunity and keeping that throughout the whole process in order to control and sustain. So when Six Sigma projects end with control, however, in reality, it's open-ended and it implies that feedback loop of improvement, control, and monitoring completed projects. So once you have it implemented, you just don't let it go. You have to continue for that continuous improvement. And when I looked at this, I established the limit or where that alarm would go off at being 75%. And when I say 75%, that means in those classroom observations that we're doing in those 10 practices, we need to see 75% of those being evident. And so you can see where that falls within the pre, the mid, and the post-PD. That brings me to the end of my project, looking at the effect of professional development on learner-centered pedagogy and best practices, and whether it's really working towards improving student engagement and collaboration. So thank you for this opportunity. Obviously, with being in this part of it, I'm not able to answer specific questions, but certainly will, in the feedback section, if there are questions, be able to answer those as well as via a Zoom meeting if required, or email as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present my Six Sigma project.